To begin with, as we are Christian, we live in a special time in this world. One more time, as a Christian, we live in a special time in this world. Especially, it is called Kairos in Greek. Have you heard of Kairos? Kairos? To be specific, Kairos refers to God's time. Kairos refers to God's time. In other words, it is God's appointed time to act. Therefore, as a Christian, we live in God's time, Kairos, in our lives. Especially Louis Brantley, he mentioned the purpose of time. He said that Kairos time is designed to help us fulfill our God-given purpose in life. Likewise, God works for us in His time. One more time, God works for us in His time. Therefore, God is in control. In other words, we live in His time, Kairos, in order to accomplish God's work. Especially today, we can find out how God works for one person in His time through this passage. So let us meditate on God and His time through this passage. So let us read book of Genesis chapter 45 and verse 8 one more time. Read, go. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord over his house and lord over all the land of Egypt. To begin with, let us find out the background of the passage today. Especially today, it is just Joseph's story. Therefore, we should first remember Joseph. Who is Joseph? Especially, Joseph's life was not an ordinary, but rather his life was extraordinary according to God's plan. As you saw the diagram here, Joseph's brother felt jealous and sold Joseph out to the slavery. Unfortunately, Joseph's life was tragedy. Of course, Joseph, he became a great servant of Potiphar. However, Potiphar's wife made Joseph into trouble. Therefore, Joseph became a prisoner. Nevertheless, God was still with Joseph. God was still with Joseph. For example, let us read the book of Genesis chapter 39 and verse 21. Read, go. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Even though Joseph was in the prison, God was still with Joseph in God's time. Yes, God was still with Joseph in his time of troubles. Also, Joseph, he could interpret dream by God's wisdom. According to his interpretation, he helped King Pharaoh to protect the family of the nation. Therefore, Joseph, he became the ruler in Egypt. Yes, it was God's perfect plan for Joseph. In other words, God rose Joseph up from the pit to the ruler. So you understand the background of the Joseph? Yes, God was still with Joseph. No matter how bad event happened to Joseph, God was still with him in his time. Especially, we can find out how God worked in his time through the passage today. So let us read verse 8 one more time together. Ready, go. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord over his house and lord over all the land of Egypt. At that time, there was a great famine. Therefore, Joseph's brother, they came to Joseph, who was a ruler who controls and manages the foods for the nation. At the time, Joseph's brother, they did not recognize Joseph as his brother. They just need the food for their family and themselves to live in. However, Joseph, he recognized his brothers first. Of course, Joseph might be angry about his brothers who threw him away into the pit. Therefore, Joseph might give a punishment to his brother who was guilty. Nevertheless, Joseph, he decided to forgive his brothers. For example, let us read Genesis chapter 45 and verse 4. Ready, go. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." I am your brother Joseph. Yeah, Joseph did not get angry, but later he welcomed his brother in love. In other words, he forgave their guilt. Especially Joseph's brothers, their fear, since they thought Joseph would give a punishment. However, Joseph comforted them who were fearful. So after Joseph comforted his brother, he shared how God worked in his life. Can you read together the red color? Ready, go. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, He has made me a father. But God. Yes, Joseph, he was assured that his brothers did not send him into Egypt, but later God sent him into Egypt according to God's plan. It was the providence of God for Joseph's life. Of course, Joseph's brothers designed by selling Joseph into Egypt, but God designed to accomplish his plan for Joseph. Therefore, Joseph, he became a ruler according to God's plan in his time. It was not Joseph's brothers, but it was God's doing for Joseph. It was God's doing for Joseph. Therefore, Joseph experienced the goodness of God in God's time. That's why Joseph was glad that God sent him into Egypt. Of course, Joseph had to suffer and overcame many troubles in his life. Nevertheless, Joseph was assured that God only sent him in his time. Especially Joseph explained how God sent and how God worked in his life through the passage today. First of all, Joseph became a father to Pharaoh. Can you say together? A father to Pharaoh. Especially the father, the word father refers to advisor. So as father gives advice to their children, Joseph gave advice to King Pharaoh in order to solve the problem of the famine. In other words, Joseph gave advice to King Pharaoh about the plan of the famine. Therefore, Joseph could become a father to Pharaoh. A father to Pharaoh. Also, Joseph became a ruler over all the land of Egypt. For example, let us read book of Genesis chapter 41 and verse 41. Ready, go. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Yes, King Pharaoh gave authority to Joseph to rule over the land of Egypt. In other words, God gave wisdom to Joseph in order to manage the land of Egypt. It was possible through God's wisdom. Likewise, Joseph was assured that God sent him for a purpose. God sent him for a purpose. Yes, God sent Joseph into Egypt to save God's people who were suffer from the time of famine. It was God's perfect plan in God's time. Therefore, Joseph, he did not blame his brothers, but rather Joseph was glad that God sent him into the Egypt. Likewise, God worked for Joseph according to his perfect plan in his time. God saved both Joseph and his people who suffered from the time of famine. Therefore, it was God's salvation story for Joseph. So today, we meditate on God's salvation story for Joseph. Especially, God worked for Joseph according to God's plan in his time. Every time Joseph struggled, God was still there. Therefore, God sent Joseph for his good will, his good plan. However, this salvation story did not end yet, since it teaches us to live as Christians once again. First of all, God used a prepared one in his time. Can you read it together? Ready, go? God used a prepared one in his time. Especially Joseph did not just give up or blame God for his troubles. To be specific, Joseph, he only followed God's plan in his time of trouble. Also, he tried to keep his holiness when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. He kept his right relationship with God and his boss Potiphar. Yes, Joseph, he tried to do good things in his time. Also, when Joseph became a prisoner, he did not give up. Especially Joseph, he worked hard in time of troubles in prison. Therefore, people saw his diligence and his hard work. Furthermore, when he became the ruler, he always planned and helped others for the nation. Therefore, God saw Joseph's life. Therefore, God used him as a ruler in Egypt. In other words, Joseph, he has been prepared for his life in God's time. In the same way, God also wants us to be prepared first in his time. In other words, as Joseph endured all his pain and sorrow, we should overcome all our pains by faith to become a prepared one in our lives. Especially the Apostle Paul, he also mentioned the purpose of Christian life. For example, let us read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. Ready, go. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Yes, the Apostle Paul encouraged believers to overcome their time of preparation by faith. As the Apostle Paul himself overcame all his pain in his ministry, he encouraged believers to stand firm in their time of preparation. Of course, Joseph, he had to suffer and encounter difficulties in his life. Nevertheless, Joseph, he did not give up as the apostle Paul, but later Joseph, he was ready to do it for God's glory. In the same way, as Joseph worked hard, we should be the prepared one in God's time. We should be the prepared one in God's time. For example, I want to share my story with you. As you know, I did not know how God would lead my life. After I decided to plant Ordinary Church, I was looking for a place to worship. So at that time, God opened the door to work at cafe as a barista. So we used that cafe place for worship. And furthermore, God opened the door for me to open my own cafe here at Ordinary Cafe 2 years ago. And by God's grace, it has been a year and a half. And as you can see in the picture, there are many customers who came here even though it was a small place. Yes, I had to be prepared for making a better coffee for customer. Unfortunately, our cafe has no hot water, so sometimes I had to suffer with pain in the skin. Nevertheless, I did not give up, but I worked hard. Therefore, I can move to the new place in March. It's a much bigger place. The reason why I share my story is because God also wants us to be prepared for His time. When we are prepared in His time, God will use us in order to accomplish His plan for us. Therefore now, it is your turn to be prepared one. Can we do it one more time together? Ready, go. God use a prepared one in His time. Yes, God will use your life for His glory in His time. And secondly, God works for those who trust in God's time. Can we do it together? Ready, go. God works for those who trust in God's time. Yes, Joseph was assured that God will use him in his time. Especially Joseph strongly believed that God sent him into Egypt, not his brothers. It was God's perfect plan for his time. Especially, we can also find one of the doctrines of God in the salvation story of Joseph. Yes, God's sovereignty. Can you say it together? God's sovereignty. So what is God's sovereignty? For example, Lexham Survey Theology mentioned the definition. It said that God's sovereignty refers to His absolute and unlimited rule over all His creatures and their circumstance. Yes, God rules and controls His creature according to His plan. In other words, it is God's power and authority to do whatever His will and His plan for His people. That's why God ruled over the life of Joseph in his time. God's sovereignty in Korean word, it is 하나님의 주권. Yes, it was a lifetime when there was a famine. If there was no famine, then Joseph could not meet his brothers again. Also, God used the wisdom of Joseph to solve the problem of the famine in Egypt. Also, if Joseph did not trust in God's time, he might have already gave up his life in his time of trouble. However, Joseph, he strongly believed in God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. He trusted God who was still working in his life in God's time. In the same way, we should trust in God's time in our lives. Especially King Solomon, he also mentioned God's time in his life. For example, let us read the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. Ready, go. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity to man's heart, yes, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Especially when King Solomon used the word beautiful, it used Hebrew yape. Hebrew yape, it refers to good and appropriate. Likewise, King Solomon, he was assured that God's time was good for his people. That's why God also worked for good in his time for Joseph. No matter how Joseph suffered, it was good time. It was good time for him according to God's plan. That's why Joseph also trusted in God's time because it was good, yape, as well. In other words, Joseph was able to trust God who worked for good in his time. For example, I want to share one more story about Ordinary Church again. As you know, our church has small number of congregation, so people come and go according to their plans, their time. Therefore, when I see the empty chair, I always pray that God please fill this place with His people in His time. And by God's grace, last week, God answered my prayer since our pianist was absent. But God's time, God fulfilled my prayer. God answered my prayer. So, Shia is back. So let us give things to God. And there's one more good news. Moses, he will come back Korea from Kenya on March 6th. So let us give thanks to God once again. So yeah, I was glad that God answered my prayer since I only trusted in God's time. Therefore, God provide what I needed for our ordinary church once again. The reason why I share my story is because God also wants us to trust His time in our circumstance. When we trust in His time, God will accomplish His plan for us. So I'm sure that God will continue to send His people do new work to our ordinary church as we move to the new place as well. Also, the Apostle Paul, he also mentioned the purpose of God. For example, let us read some Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. Read go. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Likewise, the Apostle Paul, he was assured that God was working for good according to His purpose and plan. He strongly believed that God would keep His divine promise for him. Even though the Apostle Paul suffered, he was assured that God will keep protect him in his time. He only trusted God. That's why Joseph also trusted God's time and plan in his circumstance. In the same way, we should continue to trust God's time, God's plan in our circumstance. Our time is in God's hand. Therefore, we only need to trust God in every season of our lives. And finally, I want to share one Korean praise song written by Shinhan, and it is called 하나님의 은혜, by God's grace. Unfortunately, he played this song right before he passed away from his cancer. So let us watch together for a minute. Let us hear the melody. And when you hear the melody, think of our God for a moment. this song and passed away. Especially, there is a verse touched my heart in this song. The verse goes like this. He is God and He has sent me. By the grace of God I am who I am today. Yes, as God sent Him as a pianist, and His praise is well known and touched many Korean believers, right? And also, as God sent Joseph according to God's plan in His time, God also sent us. God also sent us. Therefore, I want to ask one final question for everyone. Are you ready to trust God's timing, kairos, in your season of life? Trust. Remember kairos, God's time. Be prepared one in God's time. Trust God's sovereignty. Trust God's time. Can we do it together? Ready, go? Remember kairos. Remember kairos, God's time. Be prepared one in God's time. Trust God's sovereignty. Trust God's time. Let us read one more time together. Ready, go? Remember kairos, God's time. Be prepared one in God's time. Trust God's sovereignty. Trust God's time.